Um, my name is Chris Hartzacker from IAB Europe. I'm going to be your MC for the day, your host. I'll be introducing the speakers and going through the slides. Some general housekeeping is that you will be able to ask questions and answers at certain points during the webinar. There is a questions pane on the right-hand side of your GoToWebinar interface where you can put those in, and I will try and get as many questions to the speakers as possible, but we're on quite a tight schedule, so we may have to move ahead at certain points. To begin with, we are going to start with an overview of IAB Europe and the IAB Tech Lab and kind of explain our different roles in the framework. So without further ado, I would like to introduce you to our CEO, Townsend Fian, and we also have Jennifer Durkee from IAB Tech Lab on, and they're going to give you an overview of our respective roles in the framework.
Hello, thanks very much for joining. This is Townie, and I'm going to start with the IAB Europe structure we have in place on the IAB Europe side before Jennifer talks about the Tech Lab organization with whom we are partnering for the technical side of the framework. So this is a slide we'll come back to a few times in the course of the next couple of hours, that lays out in a very simple way how we envisage the different constituent parts of the framework. So we see it as a combination of four things, three of which we have basically centralized control and governance of between IAB Europe and the Tech Lab. And the fourth part, that light gray, light blue square on the upper left-hand side, is a part that is really the province of publishers, and something that we have taken a basically hands-off, more of a hands-off approach to. So those parts are the global vendor list in the bottom left-hand corner. That's the roster of the global vendors to whom companies that implement the framework, publishers and other sites that implement the framework have access to via the framework. We have the technical standards and that are maintained by the IAB Tech Lab, and then we have what we call the framework policies, which is basically the rules of the road to which everyone has to adhere in order for the transparency and consent framework to deliver the functionality that it is trying to deliver. And then the user interface quadrant is basically the consent management platforms that we will come back to later on in the presentation. So if we move down to the next slide, there's a little bit of feedback there, but I guess that's it's quiet now. So this is a quick look at our instances inside the IAB Europe side. So this is where the week-to-week decision making is happening on the different work tracks. We have a transparency and consent framework steering group, which is really the motor organ. It has probably about 80 people in it right now. It has a mix of companies and our national IABs, much like IAB Europe itself. We're a mix of corporate members and national IABs. The company members are a good spread of agencies, ad tech, and publishers. And so there is a good cross-industry character to the people sitting around the table, minus advertisers. I have to say that we basically don't have any advertisers directly. We have some advertisers via the national IABs, but it's agencies, ad tech, and publishers inside our mostly sitting around the table in the steering group. That steering group has spawned subgroups, some of which are turning out to be sort of standing subgroups, and some of which are just pulled together for a short time to pick up a particular task. And anyone sitting on the steering group is entitled to participate in those subgroups. That is an even more accelerated and demanding level of engagement. And for what is in theory then a smaller group to pull together and come to proposed solutions or proposed ways forward on different problems and work tracks that are identified by the whole steering group. The current subgroups are on transparency and consent framework policies, so the rules of the road, updating and revising the rules of the road as we go. A second one is has been convened to look at the data processing purposes. So anyone implementing the framework right now will be aware that we have had a defined set of purposes since the 25th of May. And but we are doing some tweaking of those data processing purposes to accommodate feedback that we have gotten from the meetings with the data protection authorities, and also some experience out in the market since May over the last 4 months. We have a small subgroup also that is organizing and managing outreach to the data protection authorities, and we have a slide on that a little bit later that looks at which DPAs we've met and with what outcomes. And then we have a framework signals subgroup, which is basically about educating the market on how the consent signal, how the signals that both the consent and legitimate interest side of the framework are ultimately intended to be interpreted, what companies need to do when they get when they receive signals with different composition. What do they do when they get an incorrectly crafted signal? Guidance recommendations as we see new scenarios arise. That's what that group has just very recently been convened to look at. In addition to the steering group, which is, as I said, sort of this big, the main engine managing the transparency and consent framework, we have a kind of outer circle of information amongst our members that's called the TCF Information Group that just get a monthly update on what's happening, but it's a much lighter load in terms of commitment to supporting the work. So that's just that's a quick look at how we are structured in-house on the IAB Europe side. Then this is a slide. The next slide gives a quick taste of some of the things that we will get to over the rest of the webinar. So upcoming milestones over the next couple of months. In the next couple of weeks, we expect to close off replies to a vendor and CMP online survey that has been running since August. And we're hoping to get some really interesting feedback from the market via those surveys. We will launch a CMP validator, which I'll also talk about in a little bit more detail later. So that will happen in the first part of October. We expect to complete a review of the TCF policies, which review is made necessary by the introduction of an extension to the framework, the pubvendors.json extension, which is going to allow us to accommodate the legitimate interest legal basis. And so because there's a whole new legal basis being accommodated by that extension, obviously that has entailed a revision to the policies, to those rules of the road. We will also, I mentioned we're doing some work to revise the data processing purposes, and so we expect that work to close off also during October. And we expect also an important upcoming milestone is Google registration of its ad products. We'll also have a short slide later on Google and an appearance by a colleague from Google who's also on the program of the webinar. So the next topic is the DPA Outreach. So we actually started doing this pretty early in April. I think even before the GDPR was actually being enforced. We have met 6. I think we've actually met maybe 7 or 8 by now, but at least these 6: Ireland, UK, Norway, France, Denmark, Spain. All those meetings have been productive and constructive and useful in different ways. DPAs have been quite receptive and interested. They've had varying kinds of feedback, sometimes contradictory feedback. And we have an important job now to try to assimilate and reconcile the different bits of feedback that we've gotten. But that is something that needs to be seen to be being done. You know, having had those meetings, we now need to make it evident that we are taking account of the input that we've gotten from the DPAs. One scenario that the GDPR definitely explicitly foresees is the idea of adoption of industry codes of conduct or certifications. We are in the conversations that we've had with the DPAs, we're not quite that far yet. So we're not it's not baked enough to be something that we are actively seeking to create a code of conduct out of. But that could be something down the road that would happen, and that would have quite a lot of advantages actually. And yeah, maybe nothing else to say on the DPA outreach point. And with that, I would hand over to my colleague, Jennifer Durkee, Director of Product Programmatic at IAB Tech Lab.
Thanks, Tony, and I'm glad we could participate with this deep dive webinar, so thanks for having us. So IAB Tech Lab is as Tony mentioned, a partner on the Transparency Consent Framework, and we're able to provide technical leadership in support and in partnership with IAB Europe. On the next slide, I've just outlined our mission statement. So IAB Tech Lab, for those who aren't intimately familiar with us yet, we are a nonprofit research and development consortium charged with producing and helping companies implement global industry technical standards and solutions. So we're aiming to grow the digital advertising and marketing supply chain while contributing to the safe growth of an industry. So other specifications or technologies that we work on: open measurement SDK, OpenRTP, ad portfolio. And critically, we are also very global. So we're able to work with the national IABs like IAB Europe and expand and grow the adoption of technical standards. We have a common set of governance that we apply to most of our projects. So on the next slide, I'll outline what that looks like for the Transparency and Consent Framework and discuss some of the ways that our governance structure is apparent. So IAB Tech Lab, as it relates to the framework, is able to provide technical governance to manage and maintain reference architecture and specifications, and also provide an iterative process of these specs. So what this looks like, and what it looks like for many of our other standards that we roll, is a series of working groups. So we have a GDPR commit group, which is the source of our leadership, who is able to provide the leadership to say, let's commit to making these changes. And that's done in conjunction with the approval and support and recommendations from the policy side of things. And then we also have two other working groups that are open for any of our members to join, which is the GDPR Technical Working Group and a GDPR Mobile Subgroup. Those two working groups are able to look at or suggest proposals where there might be efficiencies or new things that might need to be standardized. So that's an exciting area of discussion, and we're constantly, as Tony mentioned, with like pub vendors.json, able to have it back and forth with the policy working groups. These working groups are also able to have like smaller sub efforts that are able to focus on specific proposal areas that need a large amount of attention or a critique or discussion in order to move forward. When we talk later about our specifications and how to approach them, one of the upcoming areas is around how to provide security to the framework. And so this is one of the areas that our working groups are able to touch. So that structure of governance that we have, the commit group and the working groups, is able to maintain a process for iteration of the technical specifications. Working together with IAB Tech Lab, governing the technology development to ensure that the requirements identified by the policy working groups are accommodated. We're able to advance the the framework and make sure that the specifications meet the needs of all the companies who are implementing and are able to meet the needs of the policy that's required of the framework. I'll talk more later in this webinar about the technical specifications, what they are, and what the processes are regarding them. This is the role of the IAB Tech Lab in the governance of the IAB Europe Transparency Consent Framework.
Okay, thanks, Jennifer. So what we're going to do now is for about 5 minutes, take some questions from the audience. I see one question being asked a lot, two versions of which is there going to be a recording and are we going to send it, or can we see the slides after? At the risk of seeing a lot of people leave now, we will be sending a recording after, hopefully this week, using GoToWebinar, and we will also share the slides with you. So don't worry about that. Just listen and enjoy the webinar. So we have one question that came in, which mentions the OBA framework from the EDAA, and it essentially asks, what is the difference between the transparency consent framework and the EDAA framework, and do these two interact? And I believe Tony would like to address that.
Yeah, I could take a stab at this, and it's not a surprising question. So a number of the companies that are signed up as vendors on our global vendor list did have licensed the OBA framework icon. The EDAA OBA framework program is a pre-GDPR opt-out that arose, whose inception was to do with the ePrivacy Directive that was being discussed in 2007, 2008, was finally adopted in 2009. So the OBA framework program delivers an opt-out that predates the current framework. It's in some ways it's been a little well, it's a little out of date. So it doesn't actually stop data processing, which makes it problematic from a transparency and user control and GDPR spirit of the law point of view. Interestingly, it doesn't align either to the right to object under the GDPR, which is a condition for use of the legitimate interest legal basis. So something that people definitely need to have, so that the right to object is a little bit more narrow than this blanket opt-out that appears to be delivered by the OBA framework program. I think that there is discussion about updating the EDAA, the OBA framework program, and adapting the functionality to the new environment, and that could make it ultimately relevant as an option, as an opt-out option that could accompany and make possible the use of legitimate interest in the context of the transparency framework. Could be just one of the industry opt-outs like the DAA or the NAI opt-outs that some of the companies are already hooked into. So I hope that makes it sort of clear. And we communicate obviously with the EDAA organizations regularly, because those are the ecosystem organizations whom we meet around Brussels all the time on different subjects.
If I may add to that, and we will talk about that in the next section a little bit more in more detail, the type of transparency that is provided by the OBA icon is also not sufficient in our view to provide transparency under the GDPR, which is of course a core component of the transparency and consent framework, and also where the legal basis is to be consent. Again, the OBA framework does not help, and we will talk about the legal context and why that is very important to bear in mind as well. And so there is really no interaction, like the technology doesn't talk to one another. So I think that's also important to bear in mind.
Thanks, Vinci. Yes.
All right, thanks.
Those are good.
And for those of you who don't know, that's Matthias. He's going to be speaking next on policy. I'll get one more question in because we had a lot of these as well about the DPA meetings. There's some questions about the general level of feedback, what kind of things we learned. I think we do get back to that later in the webinar. But one question in particular that came out is why have we met with the DPAs that we've met with? And I think the answer to that is simply that those were the ones who were available to meet us in the first place.
Yeah, and I think it's a rolling program, and so we intend to meet other national DPAs and then also the European Data Protection Supervisor in due course. But it's something that we've been doing over a period of sort of once a month, I think, and according to which national IABs in particular, we're keen to have us join. So we're certainly open to getting suggestions about national DPAs whom companies or anyone would like us to go and meet, because it's an important effort.
Okay, thank you. So I think what we'll do is move to the next section, because this fills in very nicely onto the kind of questions we're considering, and that's what we've named the policy background of the transparency and consent framework. And to give you an explanation of that, you already heard him. We're going to have Matthias Matthiesen, our Director for Privacy and Public Policy, and we're also joined by Julia Schulman, who's Vice President and Chief Privacy Counsel of AppNexus. And they're going to take us through the policy background of the framework. So
Thank you.
take it away.
Well, yeah, sorry for not introducing myself before. So my name is Matthias. So yeah, let's jump into the legal context, which is of course really the reason for why we have the transparency and consent framework. It's been spawned out of another working group that we've had within IAB Europe that dealt with specific areas of the GDPR, where we looked at how provisions of the GDPR need to be interpreted and applied to the specific advertising industry context. And we just realized at some point that these legal challenges are of such a nature that the industry would need to coordinate and cooperate in a really unprecedented manner, both around how they interpret certain aspects and then provide technology solutions that they can meet these requirements. And so there's some important novelties in the GDPR. For the most part, everybody knows the saying, it's an evolution and not a revolution, but there are some very revolutionary concepts when looking at the GDPR, particularly from our industry's point of view. And so that first novelty is the accountability principle, which means that whereas in the past, the regulator would need to demonstrate your non-compliance, you now have a positive obligation to demonstrate your compliance with the GDPR. So that really flips the burden of proof around a little bit, and when applied to other aspects such as consent, and we'll talk about that too, that is a very important aspect of the GDPR that hasn't existed before, really. Second, transparency. Transparency isn't something that that is new in data protection. That would be on the next slide, but has been, it certainly improved or made more solid in the GDPR. So not only is there a larger number of data processing activities which are in scope and which need to be disclosed to users, but we have much more indication about what it means to be transparent in the context of data protection. So roughly speaking, it would be who is processing my personal data, for what purpose are they processing my personal data, what type of data is being processed, for how long, and how can I exercise control. So I think a very important sort of clarification is that, again, specifically looking at consent, it was possible to say us and third parties will be processing your data. Do you agree? And maybe was okay in the past, but now because of these improved transparency rules, you actually need to disclose who exactly. So not just undisclosed third parties, specifically named third parties, and not just they will be processing your data to deliver a great experience. What does a great experience actually consist of? So when we talk about advertising processing purposes, we need to be much more precise and granular about what the purpose of that data processing is. So there is also additional rules around that, but I want to focus on some very key concepts that feed into the transparency consent framework. So after transparency, which is of course the first part of the transparency and consent framework, follows lawful processing, another core principle of European data protection. And there are 6 co-equal legal grounds for processing personal data. That is, you cannot process personal data unless one of these apply. Consent is often the thing that everybody thinks of when they think about lawful processing, but in fact there are 6 legal grounds for processing, and none of them are better than the other. Instead, you need to take a look at the specific circumstances of your data processing activity, and then select the most appropriate legal ground for processing. And sometimes that might be consent, and in other times it will be a legitimate interest that is not overridden by the fundamental rights and interests of a data subject. Perhaps there is a contractual situation, a legal obligation to process that type of data. So we really need to look at that specifically. But nevertheless, that's sort of the second big part of what the transparency and consent framework does. In any case, in order to establish lawful processing, you need to provide transparency. And if you do choose consent, you also need to provide some additional things around consent. So if we go to the next slide and look at some of the key changes around consent under the GDPR, these are, again, like tiny revolutions, if you will, certainly from many data protection laws in the member states prior to the GDPR, who in comparison had actually opposite rules. For example, the GDPR is very clear that consent is an affirmative act. Well, that means that you can no longer say that if you don't do anything, if you don't tell us no, we will assume that you have granted us consent. That is something that courts in Germany until 2 years ago have confirmed as is a possible reading of consent. Under the GDPR, that changes quite dramatically. You do need some sort of positive action that signifies unambiguously and so on that the user has consented to whatever they were asked to consent to. And then there's these other clarifications that we see in the law, which really stem from some of the principles we already talked about. Importantly, that companies need to be able to demonstrate the consent that they are relying on to process data. So you can no longer say, well, I've received this data and somebody down the chain was responsible for obtaining consent and therefore I had consent. Well, that is really not good enough from an accountability perspective. You need to be able to positively demonstrate consent. What does that mean? Data protection authorities have said, well, we don't want tons of new data to be processed, but we do want you to have some sort of link that combines your processing to the user's interaction, which is what the transparency and consent framework attempts to address as well, of course, with signals. That is that link. And then things I mentioned before, transparency in order to obtain valid consent is a much higher standard. Companies must be disclosed by name. It's no longer good enough to outline categories of third parties or companies that will be relying on that consent. You have to name them by name, which in fairness makes sense. If I am a data subject, I need to know where to go to exercise my rights. If they're not listed by name, then I can't do that. And also the purposes of processing must be disclosed at a very granular level. And if consent is to be asked, then it has to be clear for what purpose the consent has been given, and then it follows that those are the purposes for which data may be processed on the basis of that consent. You can't just take that and then do something completely different. That's also inherent in sort of this purpose limitation principle. So very important changes for consent under the GDPR, and that matters outside the GDPR as well. So we have already mentioned the ePrivacy Directive, which is also known as a cookie law. It's responsible for all of these little banners that Europeans and perhaps people outside of Europe as well have had the pleasure of viewing whenever they visited a website. It said something like, hey, we're using cookies and we're assuming you're okay with this. Read more. That is because there is a separate law on top of data protection rules, the ePrivacy Directive. It regulates the storing of information and the accessing of information on user devices, which covers information such as cookies, which are physically located on a device, if you will, but it also covers other identifiers such as think of device fingerprints, statistical identifiers, right? Or advertising identifiers like IDFA and AID. It could also apply to non-identifiers, so other information, including non-personal information such as pictures of the sunset on your phone and others, right? And that requires consent. So you can't actually do the storing and accessing without obtaining valid consent. What type of consent? Well, in the past, that was very different across Europe, very different rules. Some lighter, others very close to what the GDPR requires today. But as of the 25th of May, the standard for consent is that of the GDPR that we just talked about, right? So that's why in our industry in particular, where we do rely on these identifiers at some point, consent is very important to bear in mind. And just to point out, because I often hear, well, I don't have to worry about ePrivacy because that is still being discussed. No, the ePrivacy Directive is a law from 2009. There is a new proposed update, the ePrivacy regulation, which will transform these rules slightly and make them more uniform across Europe. But the core principles are already in place today. So we have two laws which regulate privacy and data protection in Europe today, and that's the ePrivacy Directive and the national implementations thereof, which regulate the storing and accessing of data on devices, if you will. That requires consent, unless it's exempted, which are very, very narrow exemptions only. And once you have collected that data, and that data is personal data, you need a GDPR legal basis, which could be consent or a legitimate interest or any of the other remaining 4 legal bases for processing data. Where the two overlap, namely where you are attempting to store or access personal data on a device, the storing and accessing is also processing. So where this green intersection of this Venn diagram is, there is a conflict of laws, if you will. So we need to resolve that conflict, which in law happens by specificity usually. So the GDPR basically says the ePrivacy Directive is the more specific law, and it prevails in an area of conflict, which means that you do need to get consent for storing and accessing the data. Once you do have it, you may process it under any of the lawful bases of the GDPR. So that's just the legal background. And then from here, I'll hand it over to Julia Schulman, who will tie this to the framework specifically. And of course, all the various other aspects that the framework potentially addresses that do not stem necessarily from the law.
Sure. Thank you, Matthias. That was really, really helpful lead in. So as Matthias said, a group of members of IAB Europe came together over 2 years ago now as GDPR was coming into effect to look at a way for all of us to come together and handle the challenges of GDPR. But as we had those conversations, we started realizing that there were a number of other challenges in industry that our companies and our clients were actually looking to solve at the same time. And some of those were lack of control over partners and demand sources on page. So partners were concerned about transparency into who was actually contributing to the supply that ended up being shown to their users. Who were those partners? How were they using data? Data leakage goes hand in hand with lack of control and transparency. The fact that there is no single privacy policy across the industry that creates a lot of challenges, as Matthias said, as you're trying to provide transparency into all those partners that are contributing to showing an ad to a user. Continued monetization. Our clients are many times almost wholly ad funded their content. And so, this issue for them, they really wanted to make sure that they were providing proper controls and transparency to their users, but they also obviously had continued monetization in mind. And then another challenge that we had to overcome as we were thinking about how to put together this framework and roll it out, frankly, was industry misalignment over some core concepts under the GDPR and ePrivacy. So even to date, there is still disagreement over classification, which parties are controllers, which parties are processors. There is, as Matthias said, there are 6 legal bases. There's still disagreement over those legal bases and what an appropriate legal basis is for various processing activities that all of us in the advertising industry undertake. The implementation of the ePrivacy Directive, bearing in mind, as Matthias said, the ePrivacy regulation is still being discussed. So we are still operating under the ePrivacy Directive. That directive has been implemented differently in different countries in Europe, and that causes some challenges because there are very different interpretations of what is required to have consent under the ePrivacy Directive. As we kept working on these standards, there was a lot of disagreement over technical standards. There are a lot of commercial interests at play here, and those different technical standards do have different impacts on different players in the market. And then this I know is near and dear to our publisher clients' hearts is, as I put here, ownership over communication with users. For the most part, most third-party advertising technology providers, most agency trading desks, do not have direct communication channels with users. Those users are showing up on publisher sites. Publisher properties and publishers are the ones who are communicating with those users, and publishers are typically, frankly, the first line of defense when those users are unhappy about the messages that are being put in front of them, or when they have questions about who these partners are and what they're really doing with their data. So as Matthias said, we have these legal concerns that we're all thinking through, and then we have all these other challenges. So Chris, I think if you could go to the next slide, we then came up with this framework. And the goal is really allowing for transparency for consumers and publishers into partners that help monetize their services and for which purposes. Control for publishers over partners operating on their properties and processing their users' data. Control for consumers over how their personal data is used. An open standardization, which allows our industry to meet requirements to operate and communicate efficiently using a single open source standard. This was extremely important as we looked at all of those challenges that I highlighted on the page before and the challenges that Matthias brought up from a pure legal perspective. If we as an industry don't come together and provide an open standard for our clients and their partners to use, frankly, it becomes very hard for our clients to be able to choose who they want to work with. And it makes it a lot easier for them to go to larger platforms that can handle all of their needs in one full swoop under one privacy policy without necessarily having to coordinate with other partners. The standard is meant to provide flexibility for publishers and demand sources to build or work with various standard compatible providers and or UIs. Tony mentioned that on the slide where it shows the different pieces of the framework. Decentralization. It is meant to allow for publishers, again, to choose which partners they want to work with and to have data decentralized throughout the industry so that it is not held within one party. And it was meant to minimize disruption of the internet, benefit consumers, publishers, and advertisers. I think this is an important one to talk about for just a second. No one who was sitting at the table in early days talking about coming up with a standard was saying that things were not going to change. I think everyone knew that with the advent of GDPR and with some of the other challenges that I highlighted, the online advertising ecosystem was going to change. We're all used to it changing. It actually rapidly changes year over year. I think we're hoping it changes for the better. So just to be clear, no one was trying to maintain status quo, and most of us knew that our clients were going to be using GDPR as an excuse to clean up the partners that they worked with and to potentially cut down on the number of partners that they work with. So Chris, if you could go to the next slide. So just to highlight what Townie has here again, I mentioned this user interface. The global vendor list was very important to us to have that decentralized and sitting outside of any one third-party advertising technology provider. We wanted that to be sitting with an industry group in a place where technology vendors, our clients, and users could go to that list and get the information that they needed. The technical standard framework, we really wanted a partner who had the expertise to be able to manage large technical projects across the industry. And the Tech Lab has to date been a great partner in helping move things forward in a very structured and organized manner. And from framework policies perspective, that has been sitting with IAB Europe. Matthias and team have been doing an amazing job corralling many, many different voices at the table, all of whom have very different perspectives on these things, particularly on some of the legal requirements coming out of GDPR and ePrivacy. So Chris, if you could go to the next slide.
Ed, would you mind if I just jumped in here for 1 second? Because this is a common misconception I hear as well. You know, the framework doesn't address user interfaces at all. And I think we need to differentiate between the user interface not being centrally governed and there being a lot of flexibility and there being absolutely no relationship at all, because of course of signals that we generate, they ultimately all tie back to user interface, and so the policies that you mentioned, they also apply to the user interface. And I know you will talk about that in more detail, but I just wanted to stress that just because it's outside doesn't mean that we don't care about that being done right and setting some minimum standards there.
That's really, it's a really important point, Matthias. Yeah, and I will get into it on the slide after this, but I think, you know, to highlight and to emphasize the reason that UX and UI and control over messaging with users was put into an open bucket and not controlled by any industry group or one party in industry was because we heard so much from publishers that they did want to have flexibility and maintain the control to decide how they wanted to communicate with their users within the standards of the policy. And they wanted to be able to work with various different vendors or build these UXs and the back-end pieces of it themselves. So that was a very important piece that we are thinking around the framework. And so as we build out the various pieces of the framework, the two big pillars of this framework were the fact that it enables first parties to make dynamic disclosures about themselves and their third-party technology providers. And it permits transmission of signals through the supply chain using a common data format. And that's enabling companies to know rather than assume their permission and the permission of others that they're working with or that their clients are working with to process data. So if we get into the next slide here, the current standardized purposes, there's been a lot of discussion around this, and as Townie mentioned in the lead-in, the industry is actually working on updating some of these based on initial feedback that we've received from users, publishers, tech vendors, and the DPA. So for right now, the current standardized purposes that are being used throughout the framework are the 5 that are listed here on the screen. The first one is in regards to the ePrivacy Directive, so information storage and access. The second one is personalization, which the framework to date views as the further use of user data to create profiles. Third, ad selection, delivery, and reporting is basic ad selection, delivery, and reporting, and then the use of profiles that have already been created. As many of us in the industry sort of think about this as just pure cookie matching and allowing advertisers and data providers to bring data that they have already collected with appropriate notice, transparency, and choice. 4 is content selection, delivery, and reporting. This is more about dynamic content as opposed to dynamic ads. And then 5 is measurement. So if you could go to the next slide, Chris. Key policies. Matthias and I were talking about what we thought this group would want us to highlight. Again, we are still working on some updates to the policies as the purposes get updated and as the final pieces of the standard framework get updated over the next month or two. But one of them is registration, and this goes to the heart of the CMP piece. Vendors and CMPs must register and agree to adhere to the policies. Signals from non-registered CMPs are invalid from a framework perspective. And so this is key, and we get a lot of questions from publishers who have decided to build their own CMPs, and they ask, why do we need to register our CMP? We are not providing it to others to use. We are not, selling it to anyone. And the key here is so that all of the partners that they have lit up through their CMP who might be receiving data, either directly from on page or from another party that is on page, need to understand what CMP was used to provide users notice and choice, and to store that information and send it throughout the ecosystem. So every single CMP must be registered. Lawful basis. Vendors are under the policies of the framework, and this is a question we get a lot, must not process personal data or store or access information without an appropriate lawful basis. And they are bound by policy to immediately delete and stop processing any data collected or received in the absence of lawful basis. Now, there are some vendors in market who go a step further, and based on the signals that they receive, they will actually gate data. So they will not pass it along to another party if they see that that party has not, for example, received consent or does not have a legitimate interest to receive and process that data. But as a baseline, our policies prohibit any party from processing and using data if they do not have a lawful basis. Lawful transmission. This goes hand in hand with lawful basis. Vendors may only forward personal data if they can reasonably rely on the recipients having an appropriate lawful basis to process that data. And so based on these signals that we are receiving in industry, if we do not have a reasonable belief that a vendor downstream from us is able to receive that data and process it, we are not allowed to be passing that data along. And then the last one to point out is minimum criteria for a UI. And this is what Matthias was highlighting. Disclosure of vendors and purposes, including privacy policy links and legal bases, are covered under the policies. Now there's a fine line here where we do want to provide flexibility and controls to publishers and to advertisers in certain circumstances who own that relationship with their user and are communicating with that user. But there are minimum criteria in the policies that anyone who is providing disclosures to a user and obtaining consent or providing an opt-out link through a UX needs to meet and adhere to if they are abiding by the framework. Matthias, do you have anything else to add on the key policy piece?
No, you covered it all.
All right, making sure. So Chris, if we could have the next slide. All right, so policy update progress. I mentioned that there is still work being done on the policies. I think it is safe to say that as an industry, as we receive additional guidance from DPAs, as we continue to go in and have additional consultations with them, as we continue to do user testing and user trials and various tests in market, these policies are going to be living, breathing documents that are going to be updated over time. So I think the industry needs to recognize that these are probably never going to be locked into a format that will not be changed, but we're in the early stages of making our first update to them. So purposes, as I mentioned, we have ongoing work to reflect DPA, user, and vendor feedback on the current 5 processing purposes that I mentioned earlier. We are making updates to account for greater controls for publishers over vendors and additional safeguards for legitimate interests. This goes hand in hand with the technical solution that's been discussed. We are fine-tuning terminology Again, as Matthias mentioned, there have been some misunderstandings about pieces of the policy when you have many people at the table, many people with different interpretations of GDPR and its requirements. I'm sure everyone can understand that there are some debates that go into putting together the terminology in the policy, so we are fine-tuning that. And we are also working on improving documentation. This has also been a challenge over the last few months, as I know a lot of folks have been racing to get on board with the framework, which we're all very happy to hear, but also, frankly, rolling out a lot of internal work and handling a lot of internal processes. There hasn't been as much time to put together very, very clear implementation documentation. So we have working groups that are working on putting together easy to understand and visual explanations of how to properly implement the technology and the policy. Chris, if you could go to the next slide. And I think that is it. So I think we've got some time for questions.
Yes, hi, this is Chris. So we're going a little bit over time. As you see, we're supposed to be done 3 minutes ago. So I'm just going to limit it to 2 questions. I'm seeing a lot of interesting questions, so sorry that we can't answer all of them, but the show must go on. The first question that came in that we wanted to address straight away is somebody asked if we will be addressing the Johnny Ryan report, and I think Matthias would like to speak to that.
Sure. So there have been a number of complaints around the industry recently, and I think it's fair to say that generally speaking, they highlight one particular scenario. A company collects personal data, and it's not clear to the user that they're doing so. They may not have a lawful basis, and they may potentially be sharing that data further with more undisclosed entities, right? And so I think that's at the heart of both this Ryan report or complaint that's been in the news last week, and some other ones here, and specifically on the Ryan report, there was some mention of the transparency and consent framework, and it is our feeling that, one, some of the things that are being said happen or could happen is certainly true, but this untransparent and unlawful processing that is at the center of these complaints is exactly why we have created the transparency and consent framework. So I would completely reject the notion that the transparency and consent framework is part of the problem. It is part of the solution, right? So with the framework, as everyone will have hopefully already seen, and we'll see how we want to do it technically later, we want to make sure that there isn't any processing that is not transparent to the user, where they don't know what the purpose is for which their data is processed and by who and under what legal basis, and so on. And with all of that information being communicated clearly in a standardized manner in the ecosystem, companies have an opportunity to respect those signals and have signals by which they can make these decisions in an accountable manner and have records to demonstrate why they do one thing over another. So I think it's important that these complaints are looked at. There are things that are going on in the world that are wrong, but the transparency and consent framework helps our industry not be in a position where such a complaint arises against them. Hopefully, that is the goal.
All right, thanks, Matthias. So just one more question, and then we will move on to the technical part. I'm seeing a lot of questions come in about legitimate interest, and specifically about disclosing companies who make use of legitimate interest using the framework. Could you maybe just speak a little bit about how the framework is currently and looks to support legitimate interest in the future?
Julie, do you want to answer this, or should I go?
Yeah, I'll let you go. But it's such a technical policy. intertwined question.
Okay, so I think it's a fairly quick answer. All right, so the framework already recognizes the legitimate interest as a possible legal basis for processing. And vendors can sign up on the global vendor list and say, for the purpose of measurement, as an example, I am relying on a legitimate interest. The fact that this is publicly declared enables CMPs and publishers to disclose to their users that this particular company for this particular purpose is relying on a legitimate interest and where to go to find out more and exercise their rights. So it's already supported, and it's possible to disclose legitimate interest use. Is that necessary? Well, yeah. The GDPR at its core requires transparent processing. It doesn't matter what the legal basis for that processing is. The user needs to be able to know who, for what purpose, is processing their data. So there's these Article 13 and Article 14 transparency obligations, and they don't go away because you're using a legitimate interest. So even taking into consideration some of the things you need to think about when you're doing the balancing act of your legitimate interest compared to the fundamental rights and interests of the data subject, the reasonable expectations of the data subject are one of those things that you need to take into consideration. And how can you reasonably expect anything if it's not transparent to you that it's happening? So I think I would stress really hard that yes, it doesn't matter what your legal basis is. You do need to be transparent about your processing. And the framework does support that. And as we have said, we will support that in a more improved way in future as well, so that we have more concrete signals and accountability, so that third parties can know exactly what type of disclosures have happened, so that can help them in their assessment on whether or not they should process on the basis of a legitimate interest.
Okay, thanks a lot, Matthias. I think for now we will wrap up the policy background section, and then we can move on to the technical overview of the framework. And for that, we're joined by Heinz Baumann, who's the head of product and growth at Quantcast, as well as Jennifer Durkee. She's going to be back to talk a little bit about the technical specifications and where to find them. So Heinz, please go ahead.
Yes, thank you, Chris, and hello everybody here from San Francisco. I'm going to talk about kind of the technical aspect of the TLC, and also a little bit what we do going into the future, what we just heard from Matthias, an extension we're currently actively working on to give a little more control over vendors and purposes and legitimate interests. We can go to the next slide, which is a slide everybody's already familiar with. There are, as we heard, 4 main parts: disclosure UI, consent storage specification, transmission format, and global vendors. We at the technical side, in the Tech Lab working group and in the commit group, we're trying to, as best as we can, translate the policies into technical solutions, and then put that into the framework. As part of this, when we started this TLC, we actually, well, I was part of this spearheading group to come up with this framework that we today have, together with people from AppNexus, from Oath, and other companies. So let's dive into the next slide here, and we start with kind of the global vendor list. So the global vendor is a key piece that was developed that allows vendors to declare their purposes and their legitimate interest. It's, as we heard before, it's centralized, stored under kind of the governance of the IAB Europe. It is versions. Every time a change happens, the version changes. That allows us to kind of get a trail on when a change happened, and it gets transported in what you hear later in the bit stream, so we know when consent was given, which version of the vendor list was actually used, and if something changed, we can track it back. Publishers will use the vendor list as the basis for disclosure and consent requests. Basically, what that means is, based on that information, we know what consent that is available, and the CMPs, the consent managers, will provide that information in their user interface. Both vendors and publishers will need to adhere to the baseline principles. So we have CMPs to register, we also have vendors to register, and there are some clear requirements in order to be part of an approved vendor that you need to adhere to, so that the user gets kind of, in quotes, a guarantee by selecting one. I agree to that user that minimum standards is in and policy is followed by the vendor. On the right-hand side of the slide, you see actually kind of what this looks like on the purposes. There's a few fields when a vendor registers that we're asking for. So there's links to policy, their own policy, which purposes they support for consent, which purposes they claim legitimate interest basis, and a couple other information that's in that file. And if you go to the next slide, the next slide is the actual implementation of how we get disclosure and consent requests. One of the biggest problems we had is that the vendors who need to know whether we get consent from users are far removed from the actual user who makes the choice of who they want to work with or not, whether they give consent or not. So we created the mechanism, and we published a specification for JavaScript library and an API set that enables publishers and any other web hosts to customize the experience and to allow to pass that permission and user consent requests across the ecosystem. So what does it do? As I mentioned, it implements the standard minimum disclosure language. So I have a couple of slides come right after that talks about a little bit the UI. One of the things, a lot of the UI is very open, but there's a few things that are very specific because there's legal terms in some of the text, and that is a requirement to be used. It provides access to the vendor list and information about which version is available. It abstracts complexity of consent checking and storage. So this API set that we developed gives access to how do we read the consent, how do we store the consent, and then provides an API that is standardized for any player who lives on the web page to actually read that information in a consistent way, regardless which CMP has actually, or which company provided the CMP. There is a user identification mechanism built into this API. This is a little loose. We could probably have this a little better, and there's a proposal that the commit group is currently reviewing, and to make this a little more defined. And it makes the data available to downstream users via the daisy chain, or that bit string that we actually creating, that we can send down. And I'm getting to this also in a couple slides. So if we can go to the next slide, please. So the UI, as we said, is not defined. So it's it's spec'd out that we need to have some key things. There's a simple consent request, just generally yes, no. If you go to the next slide, there is a way to select purposes that we have. Currently, we have 5 purposes. As you heard from Julia, we are currently discussing changing some of the purpose text and potentially adding more purposes to it based on feedback we're getting. And if you go to the next slide, there's also in the spec requirements or in the spec'd out that we also need a user interface to show the actual vendors, and in the vendor, for the vendors to actually show their details. It's probably hard to see on the slide, but this example here shows a way to actually expose where the privacy policy is, which purposes they're using consent for, and which ones they're using legitimate interest for. These are kind of 3 key levels on the UI that should always be there, but the look and feel and how it's presented and everything is kind of really open to the implementer, whoever implements this. There are CMPs that you can get commercially. Some have very flexible UIs, others are more fixed, or, you know, as I think also was mentioned earlier, publishers or any web hosts can actually go ahead and, you know, build their own, but they need to actually register with the IAB, which I think is really important, because with the registration you actually get an ID, and in order to have an audit trail we need to know which CMP is actually used, and the only way to track this is looking at the ID. So we go to the next slide, which I think is the storage mechanism. So we had a lot of discussion when we built this, how we best do this. So it's, you know, technical feasible in the amount of time available, it's cost effective, and we can get the biggest bang for the buck to actually get all the information that we need to have across, at least as we understood it when we built this. And so we have quickly see here, come up with two methods. One is user identification and persistence method. Then the identification needed for global permissions to make possible could be done via multiple mechanisms. So it's up to the implementation how they want to store this. We do have a solution that we created through a cookie mechanism and the way to read this, but the actual implementation of a consent manager can actually decide whether they want to keep it in a cookie or they want to actually put it somewhere on the server. That's really up to them how to do this, as long as the API that is standardized can access the information and then allows the information to be passed down to the vendor. The storage options I mentioned already, we can have multiple ones. We actually do have what kind of, we standardize a lot of the vendors that provide CMP standardized is using this cookie mechanism. But we also have a version for a little different mechanism for mobiles applications, and you know, but as I said, it can be done in any way as long as it's stored and the API can access it, and the API returns consistent value that is required by the spec. Most implementations are JavaScript libraries. We actually, in the Tech Lab, we actually have a reference implementation. I do need to give a little warning that the reference implementation is a little bit outdated already from when we did this. So when you want to base it off there, make sure you consult the latest spec updates and make sure that then what's in the specs is actually implemented. But there is a reference that you can go and see how it's actually all done. If you go to the next slide. So transmitting the vendor permission and consent state. So the way we do this, I mentioned this a couple of times. You know, we can call it a daisy bit, we can call it a daisy chain, we can call it a bit string. Basically, we generate a bit string with all the information, and that has its own specification. How this is structured, and I think when we get to the next slide, there's a little bit of a view into this. Just stay on the, Chris, if you can stay on the slide that we were with the text. One back, yes. So it allows the vendor permission consent values. We compress it to make sure that we can actually get it through and with all the limitations we have on the internet. We transmit it over, and it's meant that it gets transmitted from party to party, that if a consent is given for a vendor and the vendor works with other vendors, that the string continues flowing all the way down, so everybody knows whether they have got consent from the user that actually saw the screen. There is either the vendors can use their own mechanism, or you can use the OpenRTB mechanism to actually transmit this consent string in a way that is standardized. So now we can go to the next slide, please. So this is kind of just how this all works together. So there is a section for purpose choice. Well, there's a header section which is not on the slide, that is just kind of stuff about which version we're using, the date stamp and stuff like this. And then there's the purpose choices that we can set up. There's this example shows 5 bits, but I think the purposes, we have 20 bits reserved for this. And then we have the vendor choice, the vendors, whether they're on and off, whether consent was given or no consent is given. And I think we have a string of 2000 bits reserved for this. And then there is a couple other things at the end to check the validity of this. And we also are currently looking at a proposal to put more security on top of this, to make sure that what's actually transmitted is the actual string, and it hasn't been either truncated somewhere along the way, or a malformed string comes in, or somebody tampered with this. So there's currently a proposal in review to actually put some security on top of this and a checksum. So if you go to the next slide. So this is how this kind of works. I mentioned it a little bit already. So the very left-hand side, there's the publisher or any web host. I may at this point also want to point out, this is not just publishers, also marketers should have that actually on their page, especially if they work with vendors as well. And so any web host can have that CMP, or have their own CMP that gets shown. And then consent is given, that's stored, whatever storage they choose. Like most as I mentioned, most CMPs use a cookie on the browser. And so now when the any provider that sits on the page is actually checking for this using the standardized API that we have, they will see there is a cookie, and we are in there's a user. We are in the territory of the EU, so this GDPR applies, and then they can pass it along. So they can use the, as I mentioned earlier, they can use either the OpenRTB for a standard, or they can use their own way to pass it along. In OpenRTB, there will be one field that tells us whether GDPR applies, and then the other field is the actual cookie. So it goes along. So if you go follow the green boxes, so consent is given for the CMP1 here, SSP1, and they pass it along to the exchange. The exchange passes it along to all their vendors, and at one point following this, we go exchange 1, you see that DSP3 has consent, but DSP2 and DSP1 doesn't have consent, so they are not allowed to return anything back, because they don't have, depends what they do, they at least can't use user data. If they use, they can't return anything back, versus DSP3 got consent from the user and can provide information back to the exchange. They may work with other vendors as you continue on there on that chain, and next vendors down the line also have consent, the next vendor down also has consent. So then everybody knows there's consent, and the important thing is that everybody has to pass the signal downstream. One thing that we heard in the commit group from several ad vendors is the problem that we're not seeing all the signals. We know of the kind of opt-in rate on the very beginning, but we're not getting all the signals, which kind of we suspect that we dropping signals in some places in this complicated ecosystem. So that we need to be, encourage everybody to really follow and pass this signal downstream, so everybody gets it, and the vendors can then make the decision based on the bit stream whether they have consent or not. So that's kind of what we stand here. If we go to the next slide, please. So as I mentioned, this gives control over the vendors enabled by publishers. There's transparency into the supply chain. We have an audit trail. We know which version is used. We can go back. We kind of have fair enough timestamp when this was given, so we potentially can figure out the user. It can working on improvement. I mentioned this. And it gives a better user experience and more efficient working together than if everybody would create their own thing. One of the things that we really looked at when we created this was making sure the end user, the person actually on the browser, is not getting a gazillion of different pop-ups showing up. And there's every vendor will need to listen to different signals. So with this framework, this is kind of in a way that there is a consistency how this shows up, and there is also consistency how the signal is passed down to the vendors, which makes everybody's life better. So if we go to the next slide, I think the next one talks a little bit about additional things. So as you kind of, what I mentioned earlier, the current framework, we know whether a vendor has consent or not, but we have a little hard time if, like, say, a publisher or any web host has a contract with a vendor and have some details in there, whether, there is additional, this generally the vendor declared 2 out of the 5 purposes for consent and other 3 as legitimate interest, but then in the contract that the publisher has with a vendor, it's a little different. And we don't know that, because the way it's currently set up, it's an either or. Either there is consent given on a purpose, so if a purpose is not consented to, then all the vendors that have this purpose supported will be turned off. And if you have a vendor, you can just do a binary on or off as well. So the framework needs to be enhanced in order to support a little more flexibility, so we can actually say by vendor which purpose is supported in what way. And that's basically what kind of I'm talking. There's one of the bigger proposals that we're currently working through between the policy group and the tech lab. But then the policy group is working on the policy. We try to figure out how technically we can solve this in a way that it's actually feasible to implement and not a burden for everybody. So let me go to the next slide, please. So I already mentioned some of this. Provide a standard for publishers to publicly declare the vendors that they're working with and the permission and configuration. Allow vendors to verify publishers' GDPR settings and verify and audit CMP consent strings. Enable publishers to limit purposes on per vendor basis. Enable publishers to limit features on a per vendor basis. Currently, this is an optional feature, but I think the policy team is still discussing kind of the details. I don't see this here on the slide deck, but I thought there was actually a little marker on top that this is under review. So this is going to discuss, this is not final. And I encourage everybody to give input if you have any input on this or any requests or suggestions. So if you go to the next one, the solution, here we go, spec on the review, is an out-of-band signal called pub vendors JSON. So this is similar kind of those familiar with you with ads.txt. So there's a file that the web host, the publisher, or any other web host will host on a well-known location, and that vendors can actually crawl for and get the information what the vendor defined. limitation that the publisher places on specific vendors. Instead of just having on off, they can say, I would like to work with vendor A, I'm okay with consent for purposes 1, 2, and 3, but I'm not okay that they're using legitimate interest for purpose 4 and 5, as an example. And disclosure made by the publisher on behalf of their vendors, that's basically, what I just explained. So if we go to the next slide, I think that gets a little more detail. Yes, so I mentioned already the publisher would create this file. We're discussing in the tech group to actually provide some way of a tool that can actually generate this automatically. Or in a way that is very easy for publishers, so you don't actually need to do this from scratch, that you may have some kind of UI, you just click based on the global vendor list, and you can click what you want to choose, and then it generates the file. And then the file goes into the .well-known folder on the publisher's main domain. And this is done because I need to go just right to the next level. The next 2 bullet items that the CMP as well as any vendor can actually go and crawl for this file at that location and find this. So CMPs, they go there, get the information, and they can use that information to filter out vendors and information on the UI. I think there's only one vendor currently using what is called, what is already specified under specification 1.0, and testing this out with actual publishers. And then SSP, DSPs, or any other vendors, they use that file as an out-of-band solution to augment the consent string by crawling the publisher side. So vendor goes, crawls the site, gets the information, I get a signal. The signal, one of the header information in the bit string, is actually the URL of the publisher domain. And then if we have a match, we can go look at, do we have a pub vendors file? Yes, I do. Is there anything that kind of overrides anything from the global vendor list? Yes, it does. And so that's what's going to be now used for me as the vendor, if it applies. I mentioned earlier, this is kind of optional. I think the optional only applies to the actual, if we keep it optional, it only applies really to the publishers or the web host. I think the CMPs and the vendors actually have to crawl across regardless, because if one has it, we need to know that, whether they have this or not. So if we go to the next slide. So this is the version 1.0 I mentioned. This is kind of already out, can be used. This is basically very simple, just says whether a vendor should be, I as a web host support this vendor or not. And that's what I think one of the CMPs already supports, basically just to use to filter out the vendor list in their UI. And it doesn't do anything more than that. So if the vendor is not listed in the UI, so if it is declared here, I don't, if say, it would say 1.3 and the 2 is not there, so 2 is not supported, then that vendor bit will be set to 0. So there's no consent, and so the vendor can't play. If we go to the next part, which is the more interesting thing that's still getting discussed, and there are 2 slides on this, and we're still figuring out the best technical solution for this, but there is vendors purposes, allows for the restriction of purposes per vendor, or basically that allows just based on whatever contractual obligation or contracts they have between the vendor and the publisher, so they can declare that here, especially if it, if it's not matching what's already in the global vendor list. So they can specify this here. So there is going to be the vendor like we had before, the ID, and then they can specify the purposes supported. And on the next slide, these 2 slides should have been combined, is basically on the purposes level. You can then specify what the legal basis is, whether the purpose that I have is legal basis consent or legitimate interest. And then the other part is there's another Boolean that can be set, whether this is actually required or this is optional. And so that Boolean is actually itself also optional, but this is something that can be set. So this allows to define the purpose per vendor, and it's something that we currently can't do in the framework. And as I mentioned, we're still figuring this out, because one of the proposals that we're looking at is, can we actually potentially transport that information somehow in the consent string? But we also have other information that we need to change. So the consent string itself, the protocol, we need to be updated to support this. Oh, we can back, yes. So basically there is an addition that will tell us whether the vendors is actually in use, and then there is also a version that we need to put in so that we know which version of this file is used. And we're looking, as I said, some other changes whether we can do that. So the whole thing is on the review. We want to make create a solution that is feasible to implement by everybody in a agreeable time frame, so that we actually can get this into the market and use, and we have a high adoption of this. And so if anyone has input, then come to the Tech Lab Tech group and bring up your suggestions and ideas. I think this was my last slide, if I'm not mistaken.
Okay, thanks, Heinz. We're just going to go quickly over the technical specifications, where to find them, and which ones are out there. And Jennifer is going to give an overview of that.
Thanks. And we can just go right to the next slide. I think Heinz did a wonderful job, thank you, Heinz, of outlining what the specs are, and in mostly the context of how they are used and how they are working together to support the framework. So when implementers are coming to either probably two main sources, advertisingconsent.eu, that website that IAB Europe owns, or maybe an implementer is coming to the IAB Tech Lab website, so iabtechlab.com/GDPR-tech. And from either of those resources, an implementer can be directed to the GitHub repository for this project. In the GitHub repository, which is a dynamic tool that allows us to track issues, track updates, and quickly and with process provide updates to specifications. We're able to host all of the related resources right in that repository. So that's a nice tool. That's the reason that we use that tool, to be able to deliver a really clear process around specification iteration. So Heinz took us through some of the reasons why we're having all these different specifications. But the main things to be looking for when you come to the GitHub repository are the consent management provider JavaScript API specifications. So that is the on-page JavaScript tags that will obtain consent and vendor list information. And then the API specifications also allows anyone to ping the API on page to get consent information. So this specification is very critical, very fundamental, as well as the specification for global vendor lists and consent string specifications, which defines what's actually in a consent string. It also defines, as Heinz had showed us, what the global vendor list looks like, what the parameters are. So these two specifications are absolutely fundamental to anyone who is implementing whether you're reading it as CMP in order to create your CMP and to be able to function in accordance with the framework, or if you're a vendor who's looking for what signals should I be looking for in the framework, what should I be looking for, and how should I be expecting to read consent strings. These are your first specifications. There's also a specification for mobile in-app support. So that was released last spring, so that we can support any mobile CMPs. So that specification is also listed in the GitHub repository. The pub vendors JSON specification, as Heinz really cleanly explained to us, is also posted in this repository. We have a draft version posted. In the working group, we are working through what the actual final document will be like, and that is in accordance with all of the policy guidance work that's going on right now as well, so that we can deliver a clean update to the pub vendors JSON specification alongside updated policy guidance. So anyone in the working group can have access to these like very draft level documentation, but the GitHub pages itself will have evidence and change logs of any updates that are going to be made. The process for iteration is a system of proposals, public working group review, and then public review, and then delivery of a final specification. So all of these specifications are posted. There's also a reference implementation that can get you started if you are looking to implement a CMP. And these are all available. They're all also marked with the current version of the specification themselves, and if it's a draft spec like the pub vendors JSON spec, it's marked as a draft specification, or reflecting accurately what the status is of that document. So these are all posted, and then there is also implementation guidance. Not to steal the thunder from the next slide, but there are technical implementation guidelines, and there's also policy elements that are listed as guidelines as well. Matthias, if you'd like to speak to this as well on how the policy guidelines are at play here too.
Actually, I just want to say that guidelines is a little bit of a misnomer, because these guidelines are, unless they are inadvertently in contradiction with the policies, of course, actually not just guidelines, but form part of sort of the binding body of work of the framework according to the policies. And as is mentioned before, I think it's important to point out that we do recognize it's been hard to have a really good idea and easy way of implementing these things, and so we are intending to update this the implementation guidelines. But I personally, because of their nature of not really being optional and you may follow them or not, I would like to refer to it as sort of an implementation manual, because you do have to follow it if you want to comply with the framework.
All right, thanks, Matthias and Jennifer. So again, we're getting a lot. Sorry?
I just said basically only Jennifer. I just said like 2 things.
Yeah, and of course, thanks to Heinz again for his detailed presentation on the technical specification. We have actually about 5 minutes before we're supposed to start the next section. I just want to say that we do see all your questions and we do have a record of them. So what we're planning to do is get back to you in writing, and we may even have a blog post or something on the advertisingconsent.eu website, which lists all the questions, or the big important questions, and our answers to those. So even though your question may not be called out during this webinar, we want to get back to you and give you a detailed answer. For now, our goal is just to make sure that we have the flow of the presentation go on, and that we don't run over time. With that said, there was one question that we picked out that Matthias wanted to answer, which is that there has been this phenomenon of private CMPs or CMPs who do not actually have an ID on the vendor list. So they are transmitting consent strings with invalid CMP IDs or using ID 1. And we just wanted to explain what it is that we're doing about that and what we can do about what you can do about that if you receive a string with the ID 1 or an invalid CMP ID.
Yeah, I think so. So Julia has in the previous section already talked about that. Registration is a core requirement for CMPs within the framework. The reason for that is that unless there is registration, we have no representation at all from the CMP owner that they are going to adhere to the policies. So for all intents and purposes, they could do whatever they wanted and we would have no mechanism to correct it if we were to find out, right? So in framework terms, those are you can't trust the validity of the signal. Maybe it looks technically all right, but they haven't agreed to only send these signals if certain minimum criteria are met. So there's really no knowing that those are trustworthy signals. So registration extremely important. And as part of our policies, we actually do stipulate that vendors and publishers only work with CMPs who are in compliance with the policies. And as part of the policies, CMPs have to be registered. So you are basically not in line with the policies and not a true participant of the framework if you're not registered. Now, it's technically possible, of course, for these signals to be sent without a proper CMP ID, but there, I think, is a number of work that's going on. And Jennifer already spoke to it, for example, around security and signing of consent strings and so on. Those are things that very naturally will only work with registered CMPs, I believe. And so over time, as we are tightening the trustworthiness of the consent string, it will become clearer where CMPs are not compliant because they are not registered. And also as regulatory scrutiny, frankly, increases and accountability becomes more important, vendors will probably, consider it, difficult and think twice before trusting a non-registered CMP's information, right? The whole point of the framework is to achieve this trust, and if it's not registered, that's not there. So we can do education like this. Hopefully a couple of more CMPs that haven't registered have now realized that's what they have to do. And then over time, there will be actual technical requirements that will make registration even more important. And so we will gradually get there. And then, of course, also market mechanisms in combination with sort of regulatory action that will just, consider non-compliant CMP strings, fraudulent, potentially fraudulent, right? It's sort of going in that direction. And we do have, of course, this working group specifically around signals and policy, and that would be one of the things it looks at. And then lastly, this validator, we are trying to help CMPs become compliant, right? And so hopefully that will also bring more into the fold.
Okay, thanks a lot, Matthias. So with that, we're going to move on to the next part of the webinar, and that's a part that many of you have been waiting for, I think. So we're going to have a quick update from Google, but first from Pooja Kapoor, who's the head of GDPR and data trust at Google. But to begin with, we'll have some quick words from our CEO, Tammy, to lead us in.
Thanks, Chris. Yeah, this is just an update on an item that is always, has obviously been of interest to people. So we are continuing to work very hard with Google to ensure interoperability of Google's programmatic buy and sell side products with the framework. Google will sign on as a vendor and ensure interoperability with IAB certified CMPs alongside its own CMP, TCF compliant CMP. Google is participating really actively in a number of the instances that I called out at the beginning of the webinar. So the steering group, the sort of overarching steering group, and the subgroups on the different topics, policies, data purposes. So we're getting very strong engagement, constructive engagement from Google. And as Chris said, I'll hand over now to Pooja Kapoor, head of GDPR and Data Trust from Google, who can top up the things I've said just now. Pooja, take it away.
Thanks. Thanks, Tony. Right, so I will walk through what's in the works to finalize Google's participation on the framework, how the framework will interact with Google's policies, and next steps. So since the TCF was introduced earlier this year, we've approached our integration mindful that Google's product suite is complex and interconnected, and that any changes we make have an impact on users, publishers, buyers, and ad technology partners alike. And since the framework was announced, we've been really excited to support this industry-wide framework for passing consent between parties. As Tony mentioned, over the past few months, we've participated in key forums like the steering group and subgroups like the policy and purposes working groups. And I'm also happy to share that as of a few weeks ago, Google joined the IAB Tech Lab GDPR commit group, which is the working group responsible for governance of the TCF's technical standards. We've been collaborating with IAB Europe and the various working groups to resolve open questions, such as obtaining clarity on specific purposes required for use cases like measurement. And as Tony mentioned in her introduction, we're working hard with IAB Europe to finalize all the necessary paperwork, and we'll make a formal announcement in due course when we have signed up as a vendor. And Google recognizes the importance of the framework, but we are also very aware of our responsibility to our publishers and ecosystem partners to really get our integration right. And given the numerous touch points Google maintains across the online ads ecosystem, we've had to tread carefully and thoughtfully in how we approach the TCF, particularly given the technical complexity that comes along with integrating with a new evolving framework. Once we join the TCF, joining this framework won't change Google's consent policy requirements. So the framework will be one method our partners can use to pass consent signals and comply with Google's EU user consent policy, which requires consent for cookies where legally required, consent for the processing of data for personalized ads, and for publishers to obtain consent to send an ad request for personalized ads. And in terms of passing these consent signals to Google, we are committed to ensuring the interoperability of the TCF with our programmatic ads product stack, and will support any CMP that is IAB certified. And finally, on integration timing, we are actively working on integrating with the framework, although there are a number of moving parts, including the work stream to update the purposes in the framework policy. So the new purposes will need to be finalized before we finalize our integration, as the revised purposes underpin how our programmatic products will support the framework. And so with that, I will hand it back to Tony.
Thanks a lot. Thanks a lot, Pooja. That was helpful. You've actually reminded me of a point that I wonder if it'd be interesting to have either Matthias or Julia pick up on. So in the case of the pubvendors.json rollout or the rollout of these revised data processing purposes, would either of you guys want to speak to the point about transitional arrangements or timing aspects of these changes that of those two changes, for example? So it's good. I mean, it's going to be of interest to everyone, I think.
Yeah, so I think it's fair to say, because all of these things are still being discussed, that is one of the key things we have identified as needing to get right as well. So the transition between one version of the purposes, which are currently very broadly used, to another, what does that look like where a user has already given their consent to a previous version of those purposes? How do we do we have to ask for consent all over again? How do we do that? Are we just slowly reconsenting more naturally, or those are questions we need to answer, and I don't think we have clear answers to those yet. But we, this week we're beginning to drill down on what transition has to look like, which then ties into what is a reasonable transition period from us, publishing new specifications, new policies, new purposes, and we are, of course, very committed and have an interest in making sure that we are giving everybody enough notice and enough time in that transition period to make all of these necessary changes. And so we are doing that in particular in close consultation and collaboration with the Tech Lab's commit group, GDPR commit group, who really have the expertise of what is an, as Heinz put it, agreeable time frame for implementation of these new things. So we are really keenly aware that even policy changes have technical consequences, and we do need to give a lot of time. And we will provide more information in due course once we have identified what exactly these transitional arrangements between this version essentially of the framework and the next one is going to look like.
Thanks a lot. So more on that in due course.
All right. Thank you, Pooja, for coming on, and thank you, Tony and Matthias, for giving our perspective there. I suppose this means we can move to the next section, which is the final part of the webinar. And here we're going to focus really on the practical questions. How do I become part of the framework? How do I get going and implementing the framework? So to start with, we'll have a short introduction on that by Tony about CMP and vendor registration, and then we're going to have a panel discussion hosted by myself with some folks in the industry. But first, Tony.
All right, this is just a very quick little how-to window, focusing on two things. So what do you do if you aren't registered on the GBL and you'd like to be, and then an upcoming important opportunity for CMPs. So we are continuing to see good growth on the vendor registration. We're up around 450 vendors right now, and I think around 170 CMPs. Although some of the CMPs are doing that just for their own publication or a defined set of publishers rather than being an off-the-rack third-party service. Registration is 1,200 euros for vendors and 350 euros for CMPs, and those are annual fees that are renewable, very reasonable. Registration can be done at register.consentsu.org, and we'll send links around, our own email addresses and all these useful links around with the information about the link to the recording of the webinar. Then the item I wanted to mention in connection with CMPs is a CMP validation process we're going to be running as from October. So, as we said at the start, the user interface CMP part was part that we determined at the outset based on publisher insistence and publisher feedback. We really needed to be a little bit more hands-off about, but obviously the whole functionality of the whole solution depends critically on everybody being able to rely on the signals emanating from the CMP and how the CMP captures and transmits information. So we have a CMP validation phase starting the beginning of October. We have developed a CMP validator that is intended to test conformity with the technical specifications and protocols for the CMPs. This is a self-verification tool created for IAB Europe by the Media Trust. It doesn't cost anything, and we will have an implementation. There's a beta that's been out since New Mexico, but there will be an implementation version as from the beginning of October that will allow CMPs to test their code and get real-time feedback on any failures in their signal capture, signal transmission, signal creation. The test, as I say, is intended to help CMPs, and we'll probably we would expect it to evolve, become a little bit fancier, a little bit more sophisticated over the coming months to include testing behaviors in the live environment. And everyone that signed up for this webinar, we will send you, give you an indication as soon as that validator is actually live. And then we have been a little bit of care and feeding of the CMP community. We have a Slack group for CMPs. Anyone who's interested in joining that and hasn't signed up yet, just let us know using the same links that we will send around with the link to the recording. That was all I wanted to mention on that.
All right. So thanks, Tony. We're now at the last part of our panel, of our webinar, with a panel discussion on implementation feedback. Now, for context, you have to remember that the framework only really came out publicly back in April. So it's only been about 5 months, unless my math is wrong. And we've had a lot of feedback from different corners of the industry, and that's why we tried to get a somewhat representative panel today. So I'm joined by Stevan Rangelovic from Group M. He's a brand safety manager for EMEA. I'm joined by Krister Jones, who's the head of advertising product strategy at Schibsted Media, which is a publishing group. And we also have Jonas Dobrovolskas joining us, who's the product director for sell-side product at Adform. So we have different corners of the industry represented here. Welcome, guys. We just want to go over some, basic questions and some basic feedback that you guys have experienced in your use of the framework. And the first question that we really wanted to address is, what are the primary benefits that you've noticed of implementing the transparency consent framework?
Hi, Chris. Stevan here. I'm happy to kick off. Can you hear me?
Yeah, we can hear you fine.
Yeah, great. So from our perspective, why we joined the framework and what is actually the primary benefit of the framework is cross-industry cooperation, which essentially delivers consistency in how personal data is being treated online, but also how we are communicating a legal basis for data processing. Another benefit is the common GDPR approach that companies adopted with regards, again, to the communication of legal basis. And what I find particularly important is the opportunity which the TCF gives for accountable play field, meaning that companies, vendors are accountable as we can track and understand different behaviors within the TCF, and these are obviously important, along with open standardization that Julia was mentioning, and continued monetization for our publisher partners.
Thanks, Stevan. Jonas?
Yes, hi everyone. So for Adform, it was very important and it's still very important to support all the open standards. And this framework is actually giving the really great unification, and it unifies the approach across the whole industry. And for us, it led to faster adoption and less partner-specific development. And then also it enables for the transparency and provides the flexibility that is needed as different countries take the approach differently. So these would be the main benefits that we saw by adopting the framework.
Okay, and last but certainly not least, Krister, what kind of perspective do you have as a publisher?
So from our, can you hear me, by the way?
Yeah, we can hear you clearly.
So, I mean, as a publisher, we have a lot of responsibility now to inform our users and to give them the information and about which companies are using their data and so on. And this, the framework is a very good way of making sure that we can deliver that transparency to users, and also give them the control and understanding of how these companies use their data. So in short, it basically allows us, it makes it easier for us to comply with our obligations and to the end user.
Okay, thanks a lot for that. So obviously, developing the framework has been a long process, and there are a lot of things that still need work on, as we've seen in the previous presentations. Until now, what kind of challenges have you faced while you were implementing the framework, and how have you dealt with those challenges, or how are you working on dealing with those challenges?
So I can go first on that. So from us, I mean, initially the framework didn't really offer the kind of flexibility that was needed with regards to legal basis and so on, and control of how different vendors use data on our users. I think the pub vendors extension that's been explained here quite detailed is very important in addressing that. Another big topic, and I think we also covered that, is that the purposes perhaps hasn't been clear enough, or they have been a bit vague, and trying to explain that to the end user has been difficult. And we're very happy that there's now a review, and these discussions are really difficult, but they're necessary, and we hope that they'll come to a good conclusion.
I can add from my perspective is definitely one of the challenges which we obviously see that it's improving is lack of participation from a couple of key players and publishers. But this is a lot of the challenges that we are facing is actually lack of awareness and information about the TCF, or there are certain misconceptions. I recall, I think one of the major misconceptions about the TCF is that publishers cannot control how many vendors they present to users. And we have repeated numerous times that publishers can choose who and how they're presenting, which vendors they're presenting to users. And I think one of the challenges is also different signal interpretation, CMP implementations. And so we are very happy to see the TCF CMP evaluator, which IAB will launch, I think, in 6 days, the operational version. But finally, what is important really to understand is that this is while the IAB team and all participating companies are doing, we are doing our best. In a way, the TCF is also a learning curve which follows the GDPR implementation, and all of these challenges that I just listed and my co-panelists are being addressed as we speak in numerous working groups across the industry, but also beyond IAB.
And to add from Matchroom perspective.
Go on.
Yeah. To add from Matchroom perspective, maybe the biggest challenge was the slow adoption of the CMPs, and especially on mobile, where some important decisions had to be still made around how the CMPs will be adopted. Another thing is the approval from data protection authorities regarding defined purposes within the framework, and the need to make sure that they are more relatable to every individual. And last but not least, we noticed that there is a rise of custom solutions to gather consent on the publisher side, which also results into increased education basically for them, making sure that they know about IAB transparency and consent framework and how it can help them and the whole industry.
Okay, thanks for that, Jonas. So in this period where you've been making use of the framework, what kind of feedback have you gotten from either the market or from your own clients or partners in terms of using the framework, how it's helped or how it has impacted your relationships with these players? Would you like to take a crack at that, Stefan?
Yeah, sure. So I think what I can say is that Group M agencies, because obviously Group M being a group of agencies, we are constantly educating agencies, and agencies are in turn educating our clients. Clients expect not only agencies but also ad tech and publishers to be able to offer compliant digital advertising in many instances. And TCF is one of the solutions, right? But as GDPR is still in early stages of implementation and it's very open for interpretation, different clients are taking different approaches, and as I said, they are also considering the TCF implementation. And I think as time passes by, we will see more and more publishers getting on board. Obviously, on top of publishers that are primary target of the TCF.
Yeah, I will continue with feedback that we received. There wasn't a lot of feedback that Adform has received about the consent framework. We felt that everyone is extremely happy that partners are adopting the consent framework. And when it comes to clients, the general mood is they are very happy that there is this big and industry-wide push to provide a useful tool that helps them with GDPR compliance.
Yeah, and I can add to that I mean, what we're seeing in our core markets in Norway and Sweden is that all the publishers are responding very positively to this and are being quite supportive of the framework. And this has also been a cooperative effort among publishers. We have work groups where we're sharing know-how and best practices. And I think this is a challenge we all have. It's not something we're competing on, it's something we're solving together.
Yeah, that's really great to hear. Just as a last question, what kind of updates from your side do you think you'd like to see in the future to the transparency and consent framework?
I will start with this one. So we are generally very happy about the framework and its current state. And we are also very happy as to see the future developments. So it's basically mentioning them again that are important to us. One of them is a way to ensure our partners and to be sure about the validity of consent string. So yeah, we basically want to make sure that everyone is aware that the consent string is signed and it's valid and they can be trusted. And then from a more practical point, the consent per purpose and per vendor is something that is highly awaited in the industry.
Yeah, and for us, I mean, looking ahead, I think we are the ones informing the users, and what we would like to see more work being done on it would be more protocols for transparency and user controls.
Same here. I think that the TCF has really gone far, and it's already a good product, and all of the challenges already being addressed. But maybe what we would like to see in the future is a more standardized way for consumers to exercise their rights, tied to legal grounds, such as, for example, a potential portal for the withdrawal of consent or opting out from the use of the data based on legitimate interest, and etc. In general, it's we as the industry are working hard to give all of those possibilities to users, and every step into that direction, to more transparency and more accountability, is the step in the right direction.
All right, thanks a lot, gentlemen. I think some of those things are, well underway in terms of our work. So hopefully we can, provide those updates in due course. Are there any kind of closing remarks you'd like to make at this point?
Sure, I can. I mean, I think one important perspective here is that this isn't a done deal, right? We have to continue to work to improve the transparency, and perhaps we have a solution today that's not perfect, and there are details that we want to change or new things that we want to add. I just think that it's important that the industry gets together and do the best it can right now, and then continue to keep working together and improving.
Yeah, same here. I would actually like to extend further the invitation that is already there to more publishers to come on board, not only to implement the TCF, because that is ultimately their decision, but to come to the table and participate in the discussions into shaping the framework, which they may or they may not implement. But it's really important to have publishers and advertisers greater in engagement.
And I can only second both Christer and Stefan about the adoption of the framework. I invite everyone, encourage to adopt the transparency and consent framework by IAB. It's really great, and it helps the whole industry and each individual.
All right, thanks a lot for joining this panel and taking the time.
Thank you.
Yeah, we look forward to delivering on some of those updates, and we look forward to continuing to work. This brings us to the end of today's webinar, and I'd like to thank all of you. There's about 300 plus of you that have stayed this whole time, so thank you for bearing with us, staying the 2.5 hours. We certainly hope it was interesting for you. A few final reminders, which is to say, first of all, thanks to all the speakers who joined. Second of all, we will get back to you on all the questions that you gave us through the questions pane. Of course, this will take some time because there was a lot of them, but we want to make sure that you have your questions answered. And again, we may do that in a more public way, or we may reach out to you directly. We will circulate a recording or a link to the recording as well as the slides, and together with that, we will put some contact details so you can reach out to us as well if you have any further questions that you didn't get to asking during the webinar itself. And I believe that's it for us today. Thanks for joining, and hope you have a nice afternoon or evening, depending on where you are.